My reading experience with poetry is that I'm in the presence of somebody, and we're in that kind of potentially, well, depending on the poem and the mood, it might be that slightly late night kitchen table moment where you've sort of got through all the news and the stuff and you actually enter into where you really are and what's going on and what you really need to talk about.
This is the Listening Books Podcast, for every kind of reader, and especially for fans of audiobooks. I'm Jessica Stone, and today I have the great pleasure of offering this conversation with not one, but two special guests, poet Fiona Bennett and actor Michael Schaeffer, both from the Poetry Exchange, which invites people to share a poem that has been a friend to them in their life. In this conversation, we talk about this framing of friendship with poetry and how the way we encounter poems can shape our experience of them. I think maybe we should start by talking about how the Poetry Exchange began. And Fiona, as you're the founder, I think perhaps you're the person best positioned to talk about how this was conceived and came about.
Gosh, it feels like a long time ago now. Didn't you used to feel like that when that question was asked? Just having a new realization of how old we are, Michael, in a good way, you know? It's one of those sort of quite simple synapses in your head thing that happened accidentally, where I was invited by a phenomenal woman who is called Beth Quinco, who ran a beautiful and extraordinary festival called Wise Words Festival, which was a kind of combination of literature, all forms of literature, and great thinkers. So Wise Words, which actually in a way was before its time. There's got a lot of that kind of medley of programming about now, but actually at that time it was there weren't so many things that were doing that. It was phenomenal. And she said, would you like to do something with poetry at the festival? And I felt a bit intimidated by the title of this festival being I thought, oh, Wise Words, I don't know what I do with wise words. And then that quite quickly took me to the thought that most of the wise words that I'd received in my life come from conversations with friends. And then I quite quickly realised that some of those conversations with friends were in fact conversations with poems as well. And so I thought about this idea of, which is my reading experience really. My reading experience with poetry is that I'm in the presence of somebody, and we're in that kind of potentially, well, depending on the poem and the mood, it might be that slightly late night kitchen table moment where you've sort of got through all the news and the stuff and you actually enter into where you really are and what's going on and what you really need to talk about. And yeah, poems are kind of like that for me. And I thought, well, is this the case for anybody else? Let's find out. So the beginning was that idea was to kind of find out. And I did a number of things initially, just putting that question out. Have you got a poem that's been a friend to you in a number of simple ways? And then I thought, well, I need somebody very skillful to help me with this endeavor. And Michael was instantly the person, because there was another idea going on in my head, which was that if people were going to come and talk to us about the poem that's been a friend to them, which was obviously where things began to head, then they needed to be given something in exchange for doing that. You can't just go around asking people for their time. And so we had this idea of gifting back a reading of the poem inspired by the conversation. And that in particular felt like something that Michael would be terrific to be alongside me with, and both the conversation and the readings.
It was actually called the Poetry Survey to begin with, Fee, wasn't it? That was the very first iteration of it. Was this idea of kind of making a survey. What poems have been friends to people, and kind of there was a mapping element to it at one stage, I remember, right in the early days. But it wasn't a podcast.
Right.
We were having the conversations with individuals, and we were going, well, this is great, isn't it? This is amazing conversations we were having. You go, yeah, it is. It's brilliant, Fee, but, you know, there's only one person benefiting from it at a time, you know, other than us. And I was getting into podcasts at that time. It was sort of in that first wave of podcasts. And so I can remember we were sat at the end of a day, sort of, you know, I was talking to Fiona about podcasting with, well, let's try it. Let's get some recording equipment and see how that is. We were concerned that it might affect the conversations, weren't we, Fee? We were like, well, it's got to be fairly unobtrusive because you don't want people to become too aware of the microphones or any of that kind of stuff.
And did you find that it affected the conversation?
Do you know the truth, I think, is that it can.
Yeah.
Is that there are times when it can. And I think that we had to then find ways of settling people, you know. And so we'd always do a thing about having a cup of tea and a biscuit and, you know, just a nice little settling moment. And I think in a way that's, I'm sure you find this, Jessica, but that's sort of part of the skill of talking to people on podcasts and trying to sort of draw people out and make them feel relaxed and comfortable. And then, you know, people do then forget that they're being recorded or whatever and can just chat.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also interesting because there's kind of recording it is one layer. And then the second layer is the possibility of it being, you know, out as a podcast, which, you know, is a complicated, intricate thing. So it is absolutely the case for us that we don't commit. You know, we're still having the conversations in a sense as part of the survey of gathering this material. We're gathering these stories and these poems, and that's our primary thing. We also are recording it for an archive and for potential use in a podcast. So I think that does help, because I think that, you know, if you can really convince people that that's the case and that nothing has to go anywhere beyond this room, you know, then it helps.
And there is also a difference because we speak to a mix of people. So we speak to readers of poetry and sometimes we'll just do an open call on Twitter or something like that. People that listen to the podcast, if they want to talk to us, then, you know, we'll hold some times and we'll just invite that in a really open way. And then sometimes we'll try and say, oh, you know, let's get Andrew Scott or Brian Cox or Maxine Peake or, you know, someone that's got a little bit of profile to try and help us with our listenership and, you know, all the rest of it, increase the sort of visibility of the podcast, I suppose. There can be a difference between how people approach that.
Oh, say more about that.
Well, I suppose just in terms of if you're a public figure, there's something about the fact that we're talking to people about themselves via the medium of poetry, in a way, is what I think ends up happening a lot of the time. And I think if you're a public figure, that's a slightly different proposition. That perhaps there's some bit of your brain that's going, oh, this is going to be out there in the world. And so I need to slightly, I'm not saying this happens with everyone. And of course, people do this very differently. And, you know, I get that. But there can be a difference, I think.
I could definitely understand a more heightened cautiousness.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really appropriate as well. If you are somebody like that, you know, I think that's entirely appropriate. And I guess if that's not something that you're used to doing, and if you're not in the public eye, I think it's a very different experience, because it might be that these are people that haven't spoken about themselves much, or they haven't spoken to anyone about a poem in depth like this before. You know, that can be a really quite a powerful experience.
Yeah,
often.
I think it's a sad truth that I think very few people probably talk about poetry as a matter of course in social settings. After my experience of the poetry exchange, I was trying to put my finger on what about it made it such a profound experience. And I finally thought, outside of actually going to a therapist and paying for that time, I couldn't think of when else there would be a scenario in which I would bring something that really meant something to me to a conversation. And for the bulk of the hour, everybody in that conversation is focused on appreciating that thing with me. And it's such a powerful gift of attention. And I think it must take a great deal of listening on your part, both to the poem and to the person and what they are hearing from the poem. And it sort of led me to wonder if there's something about the practice of poetry itself, the writing of it or the reading of it, or indeed the performing of it, which trains you in the art of listening.
Thank you for saying all of that so beautifully.
Yeah.
It's amazing to hear. And yeah, I think silence is a huge kind of acoustic for a writer. Silence is a absolute precondition, or for me anyway, and for most I know. Which sounds like an odd thing to talk about silence first of all, but I feel like that is really important. And also because particularly in poetry, where it's profoundly about the space between the small number of words, that silence is a presence, that space is a presence. So I think that oftentimes we don't have a quality of attention or listening because of the amount of noise that we're dealing with. So I think I'm somewhere getting to your point that maybe because we kind of have a habit or a practice of quietening noise or putting noise away, and Michael can say more about it as a performer, that I think that gives you a good precondition, at least, that you know how to kind of make that space.
Yeah, I'm really aware that when we have those conversations, that there is a quality of attention that's necessary to bring to it. And it's I used to have one of my teachers at drama school used to say 2 ears, 2 eyes, 1 mouth.
Yeah.
Use them in that proportion, and I think, generally speaking, it can be true. I think we live in a world where everyone's kind of putting their opinions out. Everyone, oftentimes a lot of people are kind of on transmit as opposed to being on receive. And there is something about the practice of doing it. The practice of listening in a way. I think it is a practice. When we, in the olden times, used to meet face to face in rooms with people to do this, Jessica, it would always often be the case that there would be quite a lot of silence. Fee and I would we know each other really pretty well now, and so we're able to trust that silence. I think that's a little bit harder in the digital version of things. But very often we'd just there'd be 3 of us, me, Fiona and a guest, sitting in a space somewhere, and we'd just kind of allow for the silence a bit, and the energy of the poem or the echoes of the poem would kind of be with us, and we'd just sit with it until, almost like that Quaker thing, I suppose,
Yeah.
until somebody feels moved to speak, I guess.
It's very important to me, that space, actually, Michael. It's good to hear you remind me of it. I'm even getting kind of like something's happening in my body as we're talking about this, and I know how much I need to be able to be in a room with it again soon, which we are planning to do in the autumn, obviously. And but the other thing that I was going to say in terms of what you were talking about, Michael, is that, which we've often observed, is that the poem, the presence of the poem itself, is also what facilitates that kind of listening and presence with each other, because we're all focused on the poem. We're not focused on each other in a way, and that deals with a whole lot of noise immediately. It just takes that noise away, because we're channeling into something that is another frequency.
Beautifully said. Am I right that you encounter the poem for the first time? I mean, you may have read it before on your own, but that you don't sort of do your homework on it before you have the exchange, that you let the person who's bringing the poem introduce you to the poem, as it were, for the first time. Is that right?
Yeah. It was quite a quick decision. That it was quite early on. We went, let's not. Let's not know what's coming through the door. So the person, I mean, in an super ideal version of it, we're in a real space, and the person walks in, and we've been given an envelope with some poems in, which is the day's set in a sense, and we go, oh, okay, and that's great. With the digital version, we have to kind of get it in advance, and sometimes we will just go, okay, let's just
have a peek.
Let's just know what it is. But then you do have to stop yourself going any further than that, because it's not helpful.
Yeah. I sort of wonder if your personal reaction to a poem is often very different from the person who's introducing you to it.
I think, again, this is something that we recognised fairly early on, that that what was almost most helpful was to just to try to hold back our own sense of what that poem might be for us, or but to sort of try to investigate what it meant for somebody else. Where it's useful to kind of throw in it was interesting because when I read it, it meant I had images of XYZ. So it's really interesting to hear that for you, it was around ABC. So it can be useful in that way, but actually most of the time I think we try to sort of hold back from putting our thing on it, because who cares what I think about a thing? It's about somebody else's experience, somebody else's relationship with that poem, and what it's meant and what it continues to mean for them in their life.
Yeah. Do you find that lots of the same poems show up time and time again as friends to
It's
people?
really fascinating what we're having done it for as long as we've done it now, and I think Fiona said we've got about 280 poems that have been brought to us, to see the patterns. We've had no Shakespeare.
Really?
For example, we've had no sonnets. Or even, some of the actors that we've spoken to, I thought, we might get some Shakespeare. Andrew Scott might bring us some Shakespeare or something, that'd be wonderful. And he'd just done Hamlet, but no, we've nobody's brought us Shakespeare. We've had a surprising amount of Larkin.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't be surprised by it, but we've had a lot of Larkin. We've had quite a lot of Yeats. We've had Lake Isle of Innisfree on more than once. Who else have we had?
That's almost the only one.
Yes.
Where you go.
In a way, maybe most surprising is,
it's unbelievable. It's to me, it's not unbelievable. To me, it's a major part of the joy. Is that the diversity of the material is as diverse as the people we meet and the poets that have, done what they can do to meet the human experience and put it down in words. And actually the collision, because there is a kind of there are patterns, there are kind of worlds, there are registers, but they're not to do with period or culture or, they kind of cut across. You get these meeting points between, Rumi and Larkin. I mean, I can't think of one actually. I'm saying that I'd need to be tested on that, but there is that sort of sense in which the super modern sits next to the very classical work, and they speak very differently, but they're speaking towards something that resonates. And it's very interesting how you then hear. This comes to kind of some of the other work we're doing. So we also had this wonderful online evening in the middle of one of the lockdowns where we held an event called In the Company of Poems, which was for a change for us, not about conversation, and was purely about reading some of the poems that have come through the door and gathering a really terrific group of readers to do that with us. But hearing on that evening, contemporary American poet Ellen Bass next to Dylan Thomas, or it's just fantastic. And I think when you are able to find a way to place them, thoughtfully, kind of in relation, and thoughtfully in terms of the voice in relation, you hear them really. It brings something to the listening. That they're in one another's echoes somehow.
Yeah. This is the Listening Books podcast, and we're in conversation with Fiona Bennett and Michael Schaeffer of the Poetry Exchange. This event they just mentioned, In the Company of Poems, I'm told that's happening again in the autumn, so do check their website. I believe they have a newsletter you can sign up for if you'd like more details. And of course, if you haven't heard their beautiful podcast, get ready to befriend some new poems. If you'd like to hear about the poem that has been a friend to me in my life, you'll find a link to that episode of the Poetry Exchange in the show notes. That's also where I'll put Fiona and Michael's upcoming recommendations for the Audiobook Listening Challenge. I wonder, how does it change your experience of a poem to encounter it through introduction by someone else rather than coming upon it in the wild, so to speak?
Oh, that's beautifully put. I love the idea of coming upon them in the wild. Oh my goodness, that's the heart of the matter there. You've put your finger on, Jessica. Because it's just phenomenal. I mean, always they are, the poems that have been brought to me by the people we've met, they're inside me in a way that I couldn't possibly, maybe a handful of those would be friends of mine, and therefore I would have my private version of whatever that is. But there's others of them there that probably wouldn't be, but they are now, because they've been introduced to me by, with this, very powerful and specific connection. And it's something about the fact that happens, even when it's digital, happens, in person through the body and life of another human being. And it's not just me, my head and a page. There's another human life there with it. And the other thing that's really extraordinary, and I think is the test of it in a way, is where there is a poem that I have had a strong relationship with, and somebody comes through the door, it's fine. But it also now lives with me in a kind of, there are 3 parallel doors I can go through with that poem, and sometimes I walk through that door and sometimes I walk through this one. And it's the same poem in there, but there's just a different atmosphere and a different focus of attention and a different resonance.
I don't think I'm a particularly good reader of poems on a page. And I'm often not drawn to it. I have to really be in the right mood and, but somebody introducing a poem to me through their personal experience of it and their relationship with it and their lived relationship with it opens it up in this whole totally new way. It's alive, it's a real thing. It's extraordinary to me, and it goes inside of me, and it sort of does become a friend of mine, actually, in a way that it absolutely wouldn't if I hadn't have been introduced to it through someone else's experience of it. It's completely revelatory for me, and the experience of having these conversations alongside Fiona has opened up poetry to me completely, and it's one of the reasons why I've been interested to continue doing it all this time, is because it's I would hope that the podcast is able to introduce non-poetry people to poetry.
Yeah.
And to sort of take some of the curse off of it a little bit, which I still experience if you give me a book of poems. I still feel that resistance to it a little bit, that somehow, at school it sort of did feel a bit like a cryptic crossword puzzle.
Yes.
And nobody had given me the keys to unlock it. And I was like, am I getting it right? It's about right and wrong at school, isn't it?
Yeah.
Often.
So
and this is a whole other thing.
Oh, sorry to cut across you there, Michael. I've got very excited because one of the things that I love about the concept of poem as friend is that friends don't want to be solved like a puzzle, but they do want to be understood, and they offer understanding. But it's not, but that, the sort of understanding the poem is asking of you is not like the solution to a puzzle. It's not demanding that you notice every layer that is there. I would never notice and appreciate every layer of a human friend either. There are too many. And yet there is this understanding between us, and a poem offers this understanding of what it is to be human in this world, and the kind of understanding that it asks of us is such a friendly request, or invitation, even not a request, a friendly invitation, I think.
That's brilliant. That's really great. I love that. And we wouldn't consider ourselves a failure if we didn't understand every layer of our friend.
Right.
Do you know? Whereas I've experienced that as a reader of poetry, going, well, it's clearly my fault. I don't get it.
Yeah.
And I think, there is a kaleidoscope thing going on, right? Not a puzzle to be solved, but there is a kaleidoscope thing going on, which is, multiple layers, multiple patterns, multiple significances. And yes, absolutely deft craft by the poet in laying those multiple things on top of one another. And different poets would answer this question differently, I'm sure, but it's not your intention for somebody to get it when you write the poem either. It's to give an experience of something, or to send something out that has much more mystery in it than that. It's a mysterious process as a writer as much as it is as a reader, in my sense of it. And actually it's honoring that in the poet that I'm kind of trying to do, which is not to be dismissive of, the rigor of craft and all those things. They're there, but they're not the only things there. The other thing that's there is a beating heart, and in both the poet and the reader, which is bigger and more mysterious than that, which Yeats, knew so well.
I really do appreciate this idea of poem as friend. I do think that makes it more accessible to people in an age when I think poetry has got the unfortunate reputation of being only for intellectuals, or the very literary type, or that poets are really only writing for other poets. And of course, poetry belongs to this really ancient tradition, far older than the novel, for heaven's sake. And it's older than writing itself. And all writing relies on sound. Writing is meant to reflect sound, but poetry in particular relies on sound for what makes it poetry. And other than songs, because you have lyrical poetry and that is performed. But I'm sort of wondering, if we were exposed to non-musical poetry as performance more often, do you think it could shed that reputation of being too heady, or sort of reserved for some educated elite?
Well, you just put me in mind, Jessica, of when we were at Wise Words Festival in Canterbury, of being in a tent and seeing Kay Tempest perform. I hadn't ever read their work. I'd heard of them, but it was my first time seeing them on stage, and I was absolutely blown away. It was a visceral experience when poetry is performed, and it's made real, it's made flesh, and it enters into us in a different way, vibrationally, and that did make me realise that it had the power to affect me in a way that poetry hadn't previously on the page.
That was an amazing night. That.
Yeah,
I will remember that forever.
Yeah.
I mean, I would kind of say I don't think there's any poetry that isn't musical. It's just musical in different ways.
Yes.
And there's so many different kinds of poetry as well. That's, it's again sort of back to this thing of the kind of original survey thing is that I love, is this just all the multiple genres, the multiple voices, the multiple places it's coming from, the multiple places it can go to when it's read on a page, when it's performed, when it's offered. That to me is completely the wonder of the art form. And actually, I think it's it's great to kind of get away from the sort of boundaries of performance or page, or it's people with the material together. That doesn't mean to say that it's always, some work lends itself more to being read aloud, being performed, two different things even there. So there are kind of multiple ways in which it can happen. But I think in terms of what you're asking about, Jessica, I think finding ways for us to be together with poetry is definitely something that can open it up.
Yeah, how to be together. I don't know if you watched any of the US presidential inauguration back in January, but I was struck both by the performance of Amanda Gorman when she delivered the inaugural poem that she had written for the occasion. I was struck by that because, it was riveting. It was an absolutely riveting performance that I watched several times. But I was also struck by the collective gasp, and from people who I'm fairly confident do not make poetry a part of their everyday practice or are not exposed to it every day. I felt like that was a very communal reaction, and there was something of togetherness in experiencing that poem.
It was astonishing. It was absolutely astonishing. You've reminded me in describing that so beautifully of something that Krista Tippett did talk about as well in the episode with her, which is about the power of naming. And I think that's a lot what was going on in that moment, was the power of beautifully, accurately. Accuracy is a huge ask in poetry. You've got this tiny canvas, you've only got this number of lines, you've got to be accurate. If you're not accurate about what you're talking about, your poem starts, I know that when I'm drafting work, I go, oh, it's flaky there. I'm not accurate. It's not specific enough. That's not accurate enough. The accuracy with which she was able to meet that huge moment. And I think Krista talks about the healing power of the naming of something. That in naming it, we heal something. And I think that gasp was a kind of healing.
I hope so. One of the things I've been asking all our guests for this series of the podcast is for recommendations for those of us doing the audiobook listening challenge, which is linked in the show notes. And one thing you might notice is that poetry, sadly, does not make an appearance as such. But there are at least two of the challenges where poetry can get a look in. One is a book narrated by the author. So any contemporary poetry that's performed by the authors themselves might be a place where someone could meet that challenge. And then the other, my favorite challenge, is the free space, where you get to design your own challenge. I was chatting with some colleagues about this and what we had decided our free space would be, and I was surprised by how often poetry came up. And again, this is the desire expressed is from people who, like me, we don't necessarily make reading poetry a daily practice. And yet the experience of reading it when we do is always so great that we wonder why we don't do it more often. And so this came up quite a bit to include poetry as our personal custom designed free space. So I was wondering if the two of you could recommend any collections of poetry for people who are taking up the audiobook listening challenge this year.
Well, it was interesting because I was looking through some of my favourite anthologies, most of which Fiona Bennett has bought me.
That's a good friend.
Now, Michael, when you say anthology, do you always mean anthology, or do you mean collections and anthologies?
I meant specifically anthologies, because that's what I was looking for. And I do enjoy experiencing poetry through anthologies. And I was really disappointed to discover that none of the ones that I treasure in my home have audio versions.
Oh, well, now there's an opportunity.
And I guess that's something to do, well, yes. I don't know if that's something to do with the complications of permissions and stuff like that.
Could
but
be.
Fiona and I, under the banner of the Poetry Exchange, will be creating an anthology of poems, and we will be doing an audio version of it.
Oh, how wonderful.
So watch this space for that. But I couldn't find one that I wanted to recommend. Fiona, have you found collections, any audio collections?
I think I would hotly, and hotly is the appropriate word, recommend Carol Ann Duffy Rapture.
Ooh.
Which is a terrific collection. And I'm pretty sure, you may have to double check, Jessica, but I'm pretty sure there is an audiobook version out there with her reading the whole collection. And that I recommend that partly because I think I really, really enjoy her reading her work. She really takes the time and space that it deserves. She's got a beautiful kind of there's that rich kind of you've just got a full voice resonance going on in there. I really like that. And yet it's not into that kind of declaiming. She manages to do intimate and epic at the same time, which is what I adore in all my favorite actors.
Intimate
and all my favorite
and epic at the same time.
You've got to be able to do that. So I that would be my suggestion, would be Carol Ann Duffy Rapture. Now, I'm sure I could think of more. I want to mention one other reading, what's the thing? Challenge.
Yes.
Which is not the poet themselves reading, but it's a brilliant, brilliant listening experience. It's my top ticket, which is kind of poem for voices written by Alice Oswald called A Sleepwalk on the Severn. And it's 3 voices. And the poem, in a way, is expressing something about what happens when the moon touches us and when the moon touches the planet, and the different phases of the moon. And there are 3 voices who voice these different perspectives of the river and the moon and some of the characters that live and work by the river. And it's extraordinary. It's my favourite audio poetry experience.
I have to say, it's been really interesting to do this and to think about audiobooks, because I don't listen to audiobooks. I listen to podcasts. I listen to plays on Radio 4 and do them sometimes. But I never listen to audiobooks. So my audiobook listening challenge is going to be to listen to an audiobook.
Very good. Any audiobook. Just
any audiobook. I'm going to pick one.
I mean, this has just been so fascinating for us, hasn't it, Michael? Because
nice to be on the other side, isn't it?
Yeah, being on the other side, and also maybe we're sort of heavily involved in the business of recording and audio work and all this, but we don't often have the chance to stop and think about it. And it's such a beautiful connection to be doing that, guided by somebody who's got such a thoughtful approach to it, and such a purposeful approach to what it's all for. It's really made me think a lot, which is great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, very well said.
Thank you for those very kind words, and thank you for introducing poems as friends. And thank you for listening. I did check on the Carol Ann Duffy collection, Rapture, and it is indeed an audiobook narrated by the poet herself. Now I wonder, is there a poem you've befriended recently? We'd love to hear about it. You can find us on social media at Listening Books, and as usual, I'll put links for how to find us there and how to leave a review in the show notes. The Listening Books podcast is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity that provides an audiobook lending service for over 115,000 members who find that an illness, mental health, physical or learning disability affects their ability to read the printed word or hold a book. It's simple to join. For more information, head to our website www.listening-books.org.uk.